In the crowded courtroom, the air was thick with the low hum of conversation. As people settled into their seats, the Judge William Thompson sat at the front of the room behind his grand mahogany desk, his gavel resting on the smooth surface, ready for the day's proceedings. His reputation as a stern, fair, and no-nonsense figure had been solidified over the years. The courtrooms, often filled with the hushed anticipation of his rulings today, was no different. He looked over the docket for the day, scanning through the list of cases, when his eyes stopped on one name, Maria Davis. The name sounded unfamiliar, but the case was simple enough: a traffic violation, speeding through a red light. Not a major crime by any means, but a violation nonetheless. He adjusted his glasses and prepared for the next case without thinking too much about it. The sound of the door creaking open drew his attention to the entrance of the courtroom. Maria stepped in quietly with her head held high, her movements confident. But there was something about her that made the judge take a moment to study her. A calm demeanor that spoke of experience, yet there was an air of uncertainty in her eyes. She was dressed sharply in a tailored black suit and a crisp white blouse. Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she walked toward the defendant's seat. Her presence seemed to command the room in a way that was hard to explain. There was no obvious indication of her being anything other than an ordinary citizen. But something about her made the judge pause. Perhaps it was the way she carried herself, or maybe it was just a feeling that something was amiss. But the judge couldn't place it. He pushed the thought aside. As the case proceeded, the prosecutor stood up with papers in hand and began speaking about the details of the case, presenting evidence that showed Maria had driven past a red light captured clearly on a traffic camera. The footage displayed her car moving at a higher speed than the posted limit, and a witness had corroborated the information with statements saying that they had seen her car running the light without slowing down. Maria remained silent throughout the prosecutor's statement, her face unreadable. She showed no visible signs of guilt or remorse. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer any excuse or explanation. She simply sat there with her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her calmness intrigued the judge even more. What was this woman thinking? He couldn't tell if she was uninterested or if she was hiding something deeper. He had seen people try to talk their way out of fines or blame others. But there was something about Maria that was different. She wasn't like the others who showed fear or desperation. As the prosecutor finished, and the judge turned his gaze to Maria, he couldn't help but wonder if she would speak up, or if she would remain silent. Either way, it seemed as though her fate was sealed. The law was clear, and there was little room for negotiation when it came to violations like this. Yet Maria sat still, waiting for the judge's verdict. Her expression remained stoic, unaffected by the proceedings unfolding around her. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the judge leaned forward, ready to impose the fine and move on to the next case. Little did he know that this simple traffic violation was about to turn into something far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The prosecutor cleared his throat and addressed the judge once more, stating that due to Maria's prior offenses, a heavier fine was justified. Her driving record was less than spotless, and this violation was not an isolated incident. The judge nodded in acknowledgement and glanced at the documents in front of him, scanning over her previous infractions. Maria had indeed been fined before, but nothing that stood out as particularly severe. Yet he had always believed in the importance of applying the law fairly and firmly, no matter the case or the person before him. This was no exception. The prosecutor finished his argument and sat down. The judge's gaze shifted to Maria, who had not moved an inch, her posture as poised as when she first entered the room. She still hadn't said a word, not a single protest or explanation, not even an apology to the court. This unnerved the judge slightly. He was used to people trying to explain themselves or beg for leniency. But Maria seemed indifferent, almost detached. He wondered what kind of person could sit so quietly in the face of a fine with no apparent concern. Her lack of response was unsettling. Yet he didn't let it cloud his judgment. He had a duty to uphold the law, and the law was clear. He cleared his throat and addressed her. Maria Davis, he said, his voice firm yet measured, do you have anything to say in your defense? She looked up at him slowly, her expression unchanging. She met his eyes for a brief moment and then shook her head. No, Your Honor, she replied softly. I have nothing further to add. The judge raised an eyebrow at her response. She was not fighting back, not trying to explain herself, or offer any justification. He found this behavior odd. He had seen countless defendants squirm under his gaze or offer elaborate excuses for their actions. But Maria Davis seemed almost too composed. He glanced back down at the evidence, and then back at her. This was a straightforward case in his mind, and there were no mitigating circumstances to consider. Still, the lack of a defense bothered him. It was as though she had already accepted her fate, without a fight, without emotion. The judge paused for a moment, then sighed heavily. He turned to the court clerk and instructed them to calculate the fine for the violation based on the law. Maria Davis would be fined $250. The clerk nodded and began typing into the computer to generate the paperwork. Meanwhile, the judge made a mental note of Maria's complete lack of reaction to his decision. He was used to people expressing relief or anger at the outcome of a case, but she showed nothing, not even a flicker of emotion. Maria remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze forward, as though she were merely waiting for the next phase of the process to unfold. The judge gave a slight nod and motioned for the clerk to finalize the details. Maria's fine was now set in stone, and as he prepared to conclude the hearing, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a movement among the crowd, something that caught his attention. Just as he was about to dismiss the court, a quiet murmur began to ripple through the room. It was subtle at first, but it grew louder as Maria prepared to leave the courtroom. A familiar face in the gallery stood up and caught her attention. Maria's gaze shifted briefly, meeting the eyes of the person who had stood, and the judge felt a sudden tension in the air. Something was changing, but he couldn't quite place it yet. The quiet murmur in the courtroom grew louder as Maria exchanged a brief nod with the person who had stood from the gallery. The diplomat seated in the back row had risen from their seat and was now walking toward Maria. The judge watched intently as the two spoke quietly, their heads close together in a private exchange. The diplomat's voice was barely audible, but there was a sense of familiarity between the two that caught the judge off guard. They were not strangers to each other. Maria had a calm composure as she listened to the diplomat, her face unreadable, but there was a certain ease in the way they interacted. The judge's curiosity piqued as he continued to observe the exchange, unsure of what to make of it. The court had begun to settle into a strange quietness as people took notice of the interaction, and the clerk, who had been working on the paperwork, paused mid-task, her eyes flickering nervously from the exchange between Maria and the diplomat to the judge, his gaze now fixed on them. The room held its breath, unsure of what would happen next. After a moment, the diplomat turned to leave, but not before offering Maria a quick smile and a nod as if to reassure her. The judge's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room, trying to make sense of what was unfolding. He could sense something had shifted, yet he could not pinpoint exactly what was wrong. His mind raced as he turned back to the clerk, still processing the information in front of him. The clerk walked over to the judge with an expression of concern. The judge raised an eyebrow, but before he could ask anything, the clerk leaned in to speak quietly into his ear. "Your Honor, it seems there's something you should know." The clerk hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Maria Davis is not just a regular citizen. She holds diplomatic status." The judge's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his reaction. He knew diplomats were afforded certain privileges, but he hadn't anticipated this, not from a simple traffic violation case. His mind raced as he recalled the conversation he had just witnessed between Maria and the diplomat. The implications were clear. Maria was protected by diplomatic immunity and could not be fined for a traffic violation, let alone prosecuted. The judge's pulse quickened as the full weight of the situation hit him. It was a mistake he had made, and a costly one at that. He had assumed Maria was just another defendant, when in fact she was far more than that. The courtroom, which had been quiet moments ago, now seemed to hum with a new tension. As the judge motioned for the clerk to fetch the necessary information, the clerk hurriedly walked to a back office. While the judge sat back in his chair, trying to regain his composure, his mind was spinning as he realized the gravity of his error. He had unknowingly imposed a fine on someone who was immune to such penalties, someone who was not bound by the same rules as ordinary citizens. The judge's reputation was at stake, and he could feel the pressure building as he awaited the clerk's return to confirm what he had just been told. What would happen next was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Maria Davis was not the woman he had thought she was, and the consequences of his mistake were about to become painfully apparent. The judge sat in silence, his hands clasped tightly on the desk, as he tried to steady his breathing. The realization of his mistake was a weight pressing heavily on his chest. His mind raced through every detail of the case, wondering how he could have missed such an important fact. The courtroom was still and tense as the clerk hurriedly returned with the necessary documents, her face pale with the confirmation that Maria Davis was indeed a diplomat entitled to full immunity from prosecution. The judge looked at the papers, and then back at Maria, who was now standing quietly near the exit. She hadn't moved or reacted since the conversation with the diplomat, but now he could see something in her eyes that made him second-guess everything about his earlier judgment. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a calm confidence that sent a chill down his spine. It was as though she had known all along that this moment would come. The judge inhaled sharply and stood up from behind his desk, his gaze fixed on Maria as he cleared his throat and called for her to return to the front of the room. The court was silent. All eyes were on him now, waiting for what would happen next. As Maria slowly turned around and walked back to the defendant's seat, the judge could feel the eyes of the gallery on him. The whispers that had started moments ago grew louder as people murmured about the unfolding situation. The judge had hoped to maintain control over the court, but now he was struggling to regain it. The stakes had changed completely. He had acted out of turn, and now he had to address the mistake or risk losing his credibility as a fair and just judge. As Maria took her seat again, the judge turned to her, his voice a little shakier than he intended. "Your Honor," he said cautiously, "I need to apologize for the earlier ruling. The fine I imposed was a mistake. As it turns out, you are not just a regular citizen, you have diplomatic immunity, and as such the fine is no longer valid." The room was still for a moment before a soft murmur ran through the audience. The judge's eyes locked with Maria's, but she said nothing, her expression still neutral and unreadable. He had expected some kind of reaction, perhaps a sign of relief or even frustration, but there was only silence. Maria did not acknowledge his apology or show any emotion. She simply waited for him to finish his statement. The judge swallowed hard, unsure of what to say next. He had done what was necessary to correct the error, but the discomfort in the room was palpable. He had acted without fully understanding the situation, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of his own misstep. He wasn't used to feeling so uncertain, so out of control in this courtroom. It had been a rare moment of weakness, but one that could have serious consequences for his reputation. As a fair and unbiased judge, he had a choice now: to make things right, to show that he could admit when he was wrong, or to continue pretending that nothing had happened. But deep down, he knew that the mistake he had made today would linger far longer than any ruling he could make, and the eyes of the room were waiting for him to take responsibility. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier as the judge stood motionless, staring at Maria, his mind trying to grasp what had just unfolded. He had assumed control of the situation only moments earlier. Now he found himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to fix a mistake that should never have been made. The weight of the mistake hung between them, the tension in the air almost palpable as the audience waited for either of them to speak. Yet Maria remained still, her expression unchanged and her eyes steady. As she met his gaze, the judge cleared his throat again and shifted his stance, his voice now softer yet still firm. "Your Honor," he began, "I apologize once more for my earlier judgment. You should not have been fined in the first place. As a diplomat, you are immune to such penalties. I understand the gravity of my error, and I deeply regret my oversight." Maria didn't respond immediately. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her reaction, but she simply nodded once as if acknowledging his words without any further comment. The judge's heart sank slightly. He had expected some sign of relief or even frustration, but her response was as neutral as her demeanor had been throughout the entire case. He wasn't sure what to make of her calmness. It was as if she had already anticipated this moment and had no intention of showing any emotion either way. The courtroom clerk stepped forward with the revised paperwork in hand. The documents had been updated to reflect that the fine was null and void. The judge took the papers from the clerk and looked them over before handing them back with a quiet nod to Maria. He couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play here, something that he wasn't fully aware of. But he couldn't dwell on it too long. He had a responsibility to close the case and move on the room remained quiet as the judge turned to the gallery and gave a brief nod to signal the end of the hearing. Maria stood up slowly and walked toward the exit, her movements deliberate and composed. She didn't look back at the judge or at anyone else in the room. As she passed by the audience, her steps were steady and sure. She seemed unaffected by the entire ordeal, as if the entire courtroom drama had been of little consequence to her. The judge watched her exit, feeling a sense of confusion settle over him. There had been something in the way she carried herself, something he hadn't been able to put his finger on, and now it troubled him even more as the doors to the courtroom closed behind her. The murmur among the audience grew louder, and whispers began to spread throughout the room. He could hear bits and pieces of conversations about diplomatic immunity and what had just transpired. But it wasn't just the legal implications that bothered him. There was something more to Maria Davis, something more than the traffic violation and her calm demeanor that he couldn't quite grasp. The judge stood still for a moment, looking down at the empty seat where Maria had been sitting only moments before. He felt unsettled, unsure of how he had missed the signs before. Her calmness, her silence, her presence in the courtroom. All of it felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit into the picture he had painted in his mind. The clerk cleared her throat, drawing him back to the present, with a soft but urgent reminder that the next case was ready to begin. But the judge's thoughts were still tangled in the aftermath of the encounter with Maria Davis, and the unspoken question that lingered in his mind: how could he have missed what seemed so obvious now? As the judge turned back toward the front of the courtroom, he felt a sharp sense of unease lingering in his chest. He tried to shake it off, focusing on the next case that had been called, but his mind kept drifting back to Maria Davis and the way she had carried herself with such calmness, with such an almost eerie composure, as if the entire proceedings had meant little to her. And yet in the moments after the hearing, when he had been informed of her diplomatic status, he had realized that she had likely known all along that the fine was not going to stand, and that his ruling was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. Maria's reaction, or lack thereof, troubled him. It was as if she had been entirely unbothered by the mistake he had made, and perhaps even more unsettling was the fact that she had not corrected him at any point during the hearing. She had let him go through the motions of the trial without a word, no objection, no clarification, just silence. Was it because she knew she was protected by immunity? Or was there something more to it? Was it possible that she had been silently testing him, judging him? The thought left a strange taste in his mouth, and as the court clerk called his attention back to the present, he struggled to focus, his eyes now scanning the courtroom for the next case, a theft trial. He barely registered the details as his mind replayed the encounter with Maria over and over again. What was the story? Who was she really? Why had she come to court that day? Was she simply fulfilling her diplomatic duties? Or was there something else hidden beneath the surface, something that he was missing? He tried to push the thoughts aside, but they lingered like an itch he couldn't scratch, and as the next defendants stood to take their place, he found it difficult to focus on anything other than the mystery of Maria Davis and her unshakable composure. It wasn't until the court had been in session for nearly an hour that the clerk approached him again, this time her expression serious. "Your Honor, there's someone here to speak with you about the Davis case," she said, her voice soft but urgent. The judge raised an eyebrow, curious but wary. "What about the case?" he asked, still distracted by his thoughts. "Maria Davis has left the building," the clerk said quietly, "but it seems that her embassy has sent someone to follow up on the situation." The judge's heart skipped a beat. Embassy? Someone from her embassy was here to speak to him. Suddenly, he felt the weight of his actions bearing down even harder. He had acted without fully understanding the stakes involved, but now it seemed that the consequences of his mistake were far from over. He glanced toward the door where the clerk had indicated and saw a man standing just outside the courtroom. He was tall, sharply dressed in a dark suit, and had an air of authority about him. As he stepped into the room, the judge recognized immediately that this was no ordinary visitor. The man's presence was imposing, and his demeanor gave off a sense of professionalism that made the judge uneasy. The man's eyes met the judge's, and he nodded once before walking toward the bench. The judge gestured for him to speak, but his mind was already racing. He wondered if this man had come to explain the implications of his mistake, or if there was more at play than he had yet realized. As the man spoke, his voice was calm but firm, he introduced himself as an official from Maria Davis's embassy, and mentioned that they had been informed of the incident. The judge felt a twinge of guilt stir inside him. He knew the embassy would likely want to follow up on the case, and it was clear from the man's demeanor that he was not here for a simple apology. He was here for something more serious, and the judge had a sinking feeling that whatever it was, it would not be easy to resolve. The man from the embassy stood silently for a moment, his eyes fixed on the judge with an intensity that seemed to strip away any pretense of formality. The judge cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves, but the pressure was mounting. He had no idea how far this would go or what consequences his oversight might have, but he knew it wouldn't be something he could simply brush off. He motioned for the man to continue, hoping to get some clarity about what was about to unfold. The embassy official began speaking, his voice smooth and controlled. "Your Honor," he said, "I'm here regarding the recent case involving Ms. Maria Davis." He paused for a moment before continuing. "She is a diplomat, and as such has immunity under international law. The fine you imposed, while likely well-meaning, was both incorrect and unlawful in nature." The judge felt his stomach tighten at the words, but he nodded slowly, aware that he had already made a significant error. He had assumed the case was straightforward, that Maria Davis was simply another person facing the consequences of violation, but he had been wrong. And now it was becoming clear that the situation was much more complicated than he had ever anticipated. He cleared his throat again and attempted to respond. "I understand the situation. I acknowledge that I made a mistake," he said. But it wasn't out of malice, it was simply an oversight. The embassy official didn't react immediately, but his eyes seemed to study the judge for a long moment before he spoke again. "Your Honor, we appreciate your acknowledgement of the error, but you must understand that diplomatic immunity is not a mere technicality. It is a principle that protects individuals representing their countries from being subjected to local legal systems, unless the country of origin waives that immunity." He paused for emphasis. "This is not a case of a simple misunderstanding. This is a breach of established protocol, and it could have far-reaching implications for your court and your career." The words hit the judge like a cold slap to the face. His heart raced as he tried to process the full meaning of what was being said. The consequences of his actions were no longer just a matter of correcting a fine. It was something far more significant. His reputation was on the line, and his ability to remain impartial as a judge could be called into question. The embassy official continued speaking, his tone unwavering. "This could have been handled much differently, Your Honor, and now we must ensure that this matter is resolved appropriately." The judge swallowed hard, but before he could respond, the official's words took another turn. He leaned in slightly closer. "I would also like to remind you that diplomatic immunity does not simply apply to cases involving crimes, it extends to civil matters as well. This includes any penalties or fines that may be imposed by local authorities. Maria Davis is not just a diplomat, she represents the interests of her country, and any attempt to penalize her for actions that fall within her immunity could result in consequences far beyond this courtroom." The judge felt his breath catch in his chest. The weight of the situation was suddenly very clear, and he could feel the pressure mounting with every word spoken by the embassy official. His mistake wasn't just a simple oversight anymore. It was a violation of the very principles that governed international relations, and it could lead to serious repercussions for him personally and professionally. He stared at the official, his mind racing as he tried to grasp just how much was at stake here. The judge felt the weight of the embassy official's words pressing down on him, his mind racing with the implications of what was being said. Maria Davis's immunity was not just a legal technicality, it was a fundamental principle of international law, and by imposing a fine on her, he had violated it. The official's gaze remained steady, unwavering, almost as though he could sense the judge's growing discomfort. The room had grown deathly quiet again, and the judge could feel the eyes of the courtroom turning to him. Though he couldn't bring himself to look at anyone else, his thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and anxiety. It felt as though the walls of the courtroom were closing in on him. His professional reputation was at risk, and worse yet, he had no idea what kind of backlash he might face from Maria's home country. The official's words had been carefully measured, but their meaning was clear. The consequences for the judge's actions were not something to be taken lightly. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about a breach of diplomatic protocol and international relations. Could this lead to a formal complaint to the Judicial Council? Could it be taken up with his superiors? The judge wondered if this was something that could ruin him, something that could overshadow all the years of experience he had built in this very courtroom. With a deep breath, he tried to steady himself and take control of the situation, but his voice came out shaky as he spoke. "Your Honor," he said cautiously, "I am fully aware of the importance of diplomatic immunity, and I deeply regret my mistake. I never intended to cause any harm. But I realize now that I have acted improperly." The embassy official nodded, his expression impassive, though the judge could detect a hint of approval in his eyes. "But we must understand that this was not a simple mistake," the official said, his voice still calm, but with a certain finality. "Your error has far-reaching consequences beyond this courtroom, and now it will require careful handling to avoid any further escalation." The judge felt the tension building inside him, and he struggled to hide the anxiety that was now creeping into his every thought. The last thing he wanted was to escalate this situation even further, but he couldn't deny the seriousness of what was at stake. Here, his career, his position, his reputation all hung in the balance, and the realization hit him hard that he had never imagined a simple traffic violation case could lead to something so profound and so potentially damaging. As he considered his next words, he understood that an apology alone would not be enough to resolve the matter, nor could he simply dismiss it with a slap on the wrist. The situation was much bigger than that, and the embassy official seemed to be waiting for him to offer a more substantial response. As the seconds dragged on, the judge felt the pressure mounting on his chest. He knew he needed to do something. He couldn't afford to make another mistake here. But what could he do? What could he say that would diffuse this crisis and make it right? The official watched him in silence, waiting for a reply, and the judge felt the eyes of the entire courtroom on him, as if they were all waiting to see how he would navigate the storm he had unintentionally stirred. He swallowed hard and leaned forward, at last addressing the official with as much authority as he could muster. "I understand the gravity of my error," he said, "and I assure you that I will do whatever is necessary to resolve this situation appropriately. I do not wish for this to go any further than it already has." The embassy official regarded him with a steady gaze before speaking again. "Very well, Your Honor," he said, "but know that we will be monitoring the situation closely. This matter is not yet settled, and the appropriate steps will need to be taken from here." The judge nodded silently, his mind still reeling with the implications of what had just transpired. As the official turned to leave the courtroom, a sense of finality hung in the air, but the judge knew deep down that this was only the beginning of a much larger ordeal that would follow. As the embassy official left the courtroom, the judge sat frozen in his chair, the weight of the conversation still pressing heavily on his mind. It was clear now that what had started as a simple traffic violation case had escalated into something far more significant, something that threatened not just his reputation, but his very career. The room had grown quieter after the official's departure, but the judge could still feel the eyes of the gallery on him. The whispers had returned now that the confrontation was over, and he could sense the judgment in the air, the sense that everyone in the room was silently questioning his decisions, his authority. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just lost something precious, something that might never be fully restored. His confidence had been shattered in front of the entire court, and he knew that word of his mistake would soon spread beyond the walls of this room. The consequences of his actions were no longer confined to this moment. They would ripple out far beyond, and he had no idea how deep the damage might go. He glanced at the clerk who had been standing near the door, waiting for him to address the next case. But the clerk seemed hesitant to speak. The judge could tell that the entire atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The usual respect that came with his position had evaporated, and now there was only uncertainty hanging in the air. His mind raced as he tried to plan his next move. But there were no easy answers, no simple solutions to undo what had been done. He turned back to the papers on his desk, his eyes scanning the documents in front of him, but they felt distant now, out of focus. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, or if there was anything he could do to make this right. But something inside him told him that the resolution wouldn't come from a simple apology or a corrected ruling. This situation required more than that. It required a shift in how he approached his role in the court. It required a level of humility he had never fully embraced before. But it wasn't just about humility, it was about accountability, facing the reality of his mistakes, and acknowledging the consequences even if they were too big to fully grasp at this moment. The judge closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts, but the weight of everything hung over him like a cloud. The sound of his own heartbeat filled his ears as he wondered if he would ever be able to recover from this, if he could ever regain the respect he had worked so hard to build over the years. He had prided himself on being a fair and impartial judge, but now that foundation seemed to be crumbling beneath him with every passing second. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult and filled with challenges far beyond the courtroom. He would have to navigate the political consequences, the legal ramifications, and the personal toll of what had just happened. But for now there was nothing he could do but face the next case and pretend to the best of his ability that the world hadn't just shifted beneath his feet. But as he sat there staring at the docket in front of him, he knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. The judge cleared his throat and stood up from behind the bench. Though his body moved out of habit, his mind remained trapped in the turmoil of everything that had just unfolded. He glanced at the clock on the wall, noticing that the day was winding down. But he knew there was no escaping the weight of his mistake, not today, and likely not in the days to come. The next case had been called, but the judge couldn't bring himself to focus. His thoughts were still consumed by Maria Davis and the man from the embassy. The conversation with the official echoed in his mind, and he could still feel the weight of his words hanging in the air. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a fundamental misstep in how he had handled an international matter with profound consequences. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had allowed something much bigger to slip through his fingers, something that could come back to haunt him when the next case finally began. The judge listened absently to the details, but his mind was elsewhere. He nodded mechanically as the defense attorney presented their arguments, his gaze flickering between the defendant and the prosecutor. But the images in his head were far from the courtroom. The image of Maria Davis's calm demeanor, her unwavering composure, it haunted him. What had she known? What had she been thinking throughout the entire trial? Had she known from the start that he would make this mistake? Had she been testing him? Or was she just so certain of her immunity that nothing fazed her? The thought sent another wave of unease through him, and he fought to keep his face impassive. As the case continued, he could hear the murmur of the gallery in the background, but it all felt distant, as though he was observing the proceedings from a faraway place, detached from the reality of the moment. He had long ago learned how to separate his emotions from his work, but now that separation felt like a distant memory. He wasn't sure how to proceed, how to move forward. When everything felt so uncertain, the judge kept his attention on the case in front of him, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the embassy official's parting words. He couldn't escape the sense of impending consequences. Whatever they might be, they loomed on the horizon like a storm waiting to break. He wondered if the embassy would follow through with their warning, if they would press for further action. Would there be an official complaint? Would his judgment be reviewed by the Judicial Council? And even if that didn't happen, would he ever be able to reclaim the trust of those who had once looked to him as a symbol of fairness and justice? The doubts began to creep in with increasing intensity, and he found himself questioning everything he had built in his career. He had always prided himself on his ability to make sound judgments, to rule with confidence. But now that certainty was gone, replaced by a deep and unsettling doubt. He realized with a sinking feeling that the courtroom wasn't just about delivering justice anymore. It was about perception. It was about how others saw him, how they would remember this day and this mistake. And he couldn't deny the fact that his actions might forever alter that perception. As the case came to an end, and the courtroom began to empty, the judge remained seated, staring blankly at the papers in front of him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the usual sense of satisfaction that came with closing a case. Instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. The familiar rhythm of his work had been disrupted in a way he couldn't undo. And as he looked out across the courtroom one final time, he wondered how much longer he would be able to hold onto the position he had fought so hard to attain.